First of all, thank you so much to Alark for inviting me here, and to the Yale Himalaya Initiative for hosting this talk, and also to Bartendu and Vivek for helping organize the event. So we're going to be talking about the solar industry in Nepal and the sort of barriers and obstructions to its acceleration. And so we'll get into those details further, but I'm hoping we can sort of do the presentation fairly quickly, and then we can have a discussion, because I think there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in the room about the Himalayan region at large, and I think that would be really productive. So I'm going to start with a story, because as we'll discuss throughout the talk, and as everybody knows, energy touches our lives in so many levels, so it's sort of hard to downplay the degree to which access to energy and electricity interacts with so many different aspects of livelihoods and people's well-being. But one of the more tangible and sort of immediately inspiring example is in the health sector. So first we're going to talk about the Lungra Health Clinic, which is a health clinic in one of the more remote regions of western Nepal. Probably the only more remote area would be like Humla on the border with Tibet or something, but this is a really, really difficult to access region. And this particular health clinic serves about 3,800 people. But you know, it's a very trying experience to actually get there. You have to, fly to a regional airport, drive an additional 12, 14 hours. So it's very difficult to access, both for people living there and if you're trying to reach this area. So the health clinic is supported by Bialpada Hospital, which is a regional hospital in Acham. Here's a photo of it. You can actually make out there's a solar array on the rooftop, which was actually created by the founder of SunFarmer just before creating SunFarmer. So the story of this hospital is very intricate, very related to the foundation of SunFarmer. But so this regional hospital serves a large part of Acham, but it's a 4-hour walk from the Lungra Health Clinic. So it's really difficult for people to reach it in time if they have an emergency or if there's some reason that they need to reach it. So basically they're on their own for all intents and purposes. And before we built the array, the Lungra Health Clinic had no access to energy. So a number of things that we take for granted were totally impossible. This is maybe unintentionally ominous. I guess lots of babies are delivered in the dark, but of course this and many other procedures and many other things that we take for granted are really difficult when you have no access to light, no ability to power basic medical machinery that can prevent easily preventable instances of infant mortality or other diseases. So it's a big problem. And so, there were even, you couldn't charge your cell phone, you couldn't power any sort of light source. And so what SunFarmer did in partnership with a group called Possible Health, or actually it's known locally as Nyaya Health, so you might have heard of that name as well. We formed a small local committee that would be able to manage and take care of the array after it was constructed, because as mentioned before, it's a 14-hour, maybe 20-hour journey to reach this health clinic. So you definitely don't want to rely on any sort of maintenance crews that have to access it. So we wanted to make sure that the local community was really involved in understanding what functions the array would perform, and they would be able to assist in repairing it. And so we built, I think it was a 1.2 kilowatt array that, in addition to providing lights and powering some small medical machinery, can also power refrigeration for vaccines and other services. So in partnership with the government of Nepal and many supporters around the world, we were able to complete the project, and this was one of about, I think, 15 health clinics we built in this series. You can see here there's an array of lead-acid batteries, because when you have no grid, you have to put the energy somewhere when you're not using it. And you can see that there's just very simple roof racking to put the array on the rooftop. And so, now the health clinic has access to energy, and there's a lot of improvements that come with that. So, just wanted to start with that really simple story. Of course, a 1.6 kilowatt array is quite small, and while the impact for a number of people here could be quite large, it's not on the systemic scale that a place like Nepal and a lot of other places in the greater Himalayan region require to actually get them out of sort of pervasive energy poverty, where there's just totally inadequate electricity generation relative to demand. So I think I want to spend the rest of the talk talking a sort of bigger picture. How do we get to a systemic scale of solving energy poverty and providing energy access? What are the big opportunities for doing that, and what are the barriers to achieving it? So first, we're just going to talk about the basic problem, which is that is this covering the screen? I guess it's a little bit wide. So Nepal's development is perhaps stymied by a lot of things that we could discuss, but one of them that's very, very clear is lack of electricity. Here's just an image. A lot of these are telecommunication lines, but that's just an image of Kathmandu. There's probably some pilferage there where people are sort of drawing their own lines off of the main distribution line. But basically, Nepal's development is held back by a lack of electricity generation. And that's despite really bountiful resources. I think Nepal has the second highest hydro resource of any country. So there's huge potential, gigawatts and gigawatts of potential generating capacity. There's also a really great solar resource. But despite that, those projects haven't seen fruition yet. And third, it's really difficult to extend the traditional hub and spoke model grid to these remote regions. It's extremely expensive and probably uneconomical. So there's a real need for a distributed solution. So the challenge that we see is, how do you bring power to the people that need it the most, but in a way that's scalable, cost-effective, and equitable? So in the health clinic example, I think that's a really great project, but it relied heavily on donor funding, and it's not clear that building a series of 2 kilowatt health clinic arrays is going to bring energy access across Nepal. Obviously, we need a more scalable solution. So the solutions I want to talk about today, and definitely not the only solutions, because of course large hydropower could also solve a lot of these problems, not all of them. But the solution I want to talk about today is distributed off-grid solar generation as well as grid-tied solar generation. So first, just a little bit about electricity in Nepal. So basically Nepal is starved for energy. The total fleet, the generating capacity, is around 800 megawatts. And please stop me if any terms I'm using or any energy-specific talk needs a little bit of clarification. But just to put it into context, 800 megawatts, this large pie chart, compared to the New Haven power plant, which is 570 megawatts, compared to the Yale Central Power Station, which combined can produce about 18 megawatts at full load. And of course, neither of these power plants need to operate at full capacity for a lot of the time. So that just puts it in perspective how an entire country of 30 million people has a generating fleet that's not significantly many orders of magnitude bigger than what we use to power our city. So, and also grid access is low. So only about half the people in Nepal have access to grid connectivity, but many of those people, there's very little energy flowing through that distribution network. So you might be technically grid tied, but in reality you don't have great access to power. In urban centers like Kathmandu, pretty much everybody's on the grid, but as we'll see in the next slide, that does not mean they have consistent access to power. In rural areas, of course, very few people have access to the electrical grid. And of course, demand is rapidly increasing. So in the energy access space, people talk a lot about this concept of the energy ladder. So once somebody has access to lighting or televisions, very quickly they start to buy other appliances and other devices that require more and more power. And so there's sort of this cascading effect where once you have the infrastructure in place for people to actually have demand for energy, that demand just continues to grow. So demand is rapidly increasing, but the generating capacity has been totally unable to keep pace. So in terms of what that generating capacity is made up of, the blue, so something around 65% of the generating capacity is grid-connected hydropower. And a lot of Nepal's hydropower is run-of-river microhydro, so it's not necessarily these monolithic dams holding back a huge reservoir. Some of them are, but it's a mix. And then the yellow, which is about maybe 30% is independent power producers, entrepreneurs that have sort of taken matters into their own hands and acquired financing, built a project, and are just selling that power to the national utility. And then there's a little bit of thermal, so that's a mixture of natural gas and other fossil fuel uses. And then you can see there's just, so that 0.1 megawatts, that's the entire solar fleet. And this data is a couple years old, so it's a little bit bigger now, but just to put it in context, I think the largest solar array in Nepal is about 700 kilowatts, so less than 1 megawatt. And so what does this mean? What does it mean to have inconsistent access to power? Well, it means that individuals are forced to plan around the uncertainty of what times of day they're going to have access to energy. And so all kinds of sectors of life are affected, be it access to health, access to transportation, access to education. And small businesses suffer greatly as well. So rolling blackouts, when the utility deliberately shuts down different portions of the grid at different times of the day, it's hugely impactful to small businesses that require certain hours of operation. So all of a sudden they have to shut down at 7 or 8 p.m. when they have no access to light, and that can be really devastating. And then in terms of industry, inconsistent power could force you to shut down production. Maybe you have a line with 50 employees and all of a sudden you have to send them all home because the power cuts. And furthermore, any sort of like rotating equipment or large processing machinery requires regulation of frequency of the grid. And so that's something that in the US we do to a very, very high degree. We regulate our frequency to 60 hertz within like plus or minus half 1 hertz. In a place like Nepal, it's extremely variable, and so that can be really damaging to industrial equipment, which causes investors to hold back on building out that kind of infrastructure because they're not sure that their investment is going to be safe. And so to that point, investors are reluctant to build processing infrastructure because they don't have the power to do so. And so this is just a chart showing annual GDP to annual energy consumption. And so it's a fairly linear relationship. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is maybe a topic we can discuss afterward, or maybe that's controversial, maybe it's not. But it's in terms of whether a higher GDP necessarily means, or what that means. But obviously there's a clear relationship with GDP and annual energy consumption. And so an even more sort of asymptotic example is when you look at HDI, the Human Development Index that UNDP puts out, which is a measure of a lot of different factors, not just GDP, that sort of attempts to holistically measure well-being and development. You can see that as energy consumption per capita increases, it's pretty exponential how HDI increases. And then there's this inflection point where you have diminishing returns and you start using more and more and more and more energy, and things aren't necessarily better. So you can see we're pretty greedy up there with something like 15,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. So it's pretty astounding to think how different that is from a place like Nepal. So one of the issues that Nepal's energy mix, you saw earlier in the graph how much of Nepal's energy mix is dependent on hydro. That has huge implications both economically and politically, because basically because of the 3-month monsoon season, there's a 9-month period of very low rainfall that immediately follows. And so during those dry months, you can see from December to April, so this chart is showing the gap between supply and demand. So for example, in February in 2009, there was a 140 megawatt shortfall between what was being generated by the hydro plants and what was being demanded of the hydro plants by people turning their lights on and off in Kathmandu. And that's pretty huge. I mean, if we think that the entire generating capacity is 800 megawatts, this is almost 25% of the entire fleet capacity that's offline because of low rainfall. And you can see that the lowest line is 2006, then you go up to 2007, then you've got 08 and 09 and 2010. So there's a trend where every year, because demand is increasing but additional hydro plants aren't coming online, the shortfall is getting more and more dramatic. And I mentioned the political implications briefly, but Nepal also, by regulating how much water is flowing through these plants, these hydro plants, is directly influencing the entire watersheds that follow that choke point, which is a huge catchment area for India and a huge agricultural production in states like Bihar and elsewhere in northern India. So Nepal, in a way, has a lot of power over how much water flows to those regions, but they also are, in a lot of ways, beholden to their much, much larger neighbor, India. So they don't have a lot of choice in terms of when they have to turn the power on and off, other than to sort of maintain this reservoir size. And so because they rely on hydropower, so this is a chart of how many hours per week Kathmandu and the rest of Nepal experience rolling blackouts. So in early January, it's 80 or 90 or 100 hours a week that they have no power. And so that, again, this very dramatic curve is a function of having so much reliance on hydropower, which is also difficult in terms of political will, because in the monsoon season, everybody's got plenty of power, so they're not worried about it. And then when winter comes around, they're experiencing 13, 14 hours of load shedding a day, and people are extremely frustrated, and that's the time when they really want to buy solar. So the silver lining for us is that a lot more people are asking to build systems at that time of year. But then it's a lot like in the Northeast, where people make investments in heating and energy efficiency in the winter when their power bills are very high, and then in the summer they forget about it. So there's kind of this cyclicity in terms of people's frustration with their utility. So load shedding, I keep throwing this term around. This is a term that I wasn't familiar with until I visited Nepal, but every single Nepali is intimately aware of this term. And it's just another, what's that?
Entire South Asia.
Yeah, the entire South, yeah, okay, so many, many places. So it's another term for rolling blackouts, which is just intentionally shutting off power to specific regions and kind of like a patchwork effect in the city, so that different people have power at different times because they can't simultaneously provide power to everyone. So right now, I think Kathmandu is up to about 13 hours of load shedding a day, which you can imagine, it's not all at once either. It might be from 8 p.m. till midnight, and then you have power until 4 a.m. So it's inconsistent, and it causes you to make a lot of plans to sort of orient your life around when you have power and when you don't have power. So I mentioned sort of the silver lining, which is that, like, one thing that I was humbled by just talking to many Nepalis in Kathmandu was just what a deep understanding of electricity the everyday person has. I mean, people take matters into their own hands and they purchase what they call inverters, which are actually just banks of batteries that they can charge up when there is power and then use to power some appliances in their house. So almost every house is actually wired. There's like separate wiring for the outlets that have backup power and the ones that are grid tied. So you have to kind of strategize when what you're charging from. And people are really entrepreneurial in terms of just wiring up their own systems. And this is a battery that somebody was able to just sort of move around within the room and connect to whatever light source they wanted. That was in a pretty rural area. But so people come up with great ways to get around the fact that they don't have consistent power. So we've mentioned a lot about hydropower, heavy reliance on hydro. Why would we consider another generating source like solar for a case like Nepal? One of the reasons is that there's complementary generation profile relative to hydropower. So I mentioned that hydropower production is really high in the monsoon seasons and really low in the dry season. So Kathmandu is quite sunny, pretty much year-round, but solar actually has the highest generating profile in the non-monsoon months when there's less cloud cover and insolation is higher. And so there's kind of this complementary effect where when hydropower is really high, solar power is low and vice versa. So there's an opportunity there to kind of smooth out that imbalance that we talked about earlier. Also, solar has really low maintenance and ongoing operating costs. Once you've installed it, it's virtually free to run. It's just the upfront cost, which, to point number 3, has been rapidly dropping. In the US, it was maybe $8 a watt 10 years ago, then it dropped to $4 a watt, then $2. It keeps halving in price, and the quality of those cheaper components is also improving. And as I mentioned, there's an excellent solar resource in Nepal, and solar is really quickly deployable. I mean, some of these large hydro projects may take 5 or 6 years, and actually recently a Norwegian company, after spending, I think, 6 years in conversation with NEA and all these institutions in Nepal, just was unable to get their project over the line. They just left the country and abandoned the project, and probably tens of millions of dollars in development costs were sunk. So it can be really frustrating to get larger projects permitted, but distributed solar systems can be deployed in a week or two. And also there's pros and cons in terms of the environmental impacts of each, but generally speaking, distributed solar is going to have a much smaller environmental impact than creating a new reservoir. So just really briefly, Nepal's solar resource is on the order of 4 to 5 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day, which is comparable to, and here you can see that the really potent solar resource is sort of in the Tibetan area and maybe verging into Humla and some of the western reaches of Nepal, but Nepal itself is pretty comparable to the American South. So it's a really favorable solar resource. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about now that we have sort of a framework for the challenges of the Nepal electricity generating fleet and what needs to happen, what's actually holding back larger scale commercial solar development from taking place. And so if we just think of sort of systemic challenges that you might encounter in many different developing economies, the first is that there's really very little regulatory framework in place. So for example, in a lot of developed countries, there's very explicit feed-in tariffs and prices that the utilities will pay if you build an independent power-producing power plant. But that doesn't necessarily exist in a place like Nepal, nor are there clear guidelines for the standards that you should employ when you're building the system. Second, and so on the right, I'm just putting sort of an indication of Nepal's progress towards resolving this systemic issue. So after we talk about these systemic issues, I'm going to talk about more accessible barriers that that SunFarmer can actually address. These are obviously sort of macro issues that it's difficult to, as an individual, alter. So in any case, the second main barrier is that there's very limited availability of financing. So from local banks, there's a requirement that they're not only financing the value of the asset, but they also ask for collateral. So you build a $2,000 solar system and you get that loan from the bank, but the bank not only claims that solar system as collateral, they also ask you to make a personal guarantee or put your building up as collateral, or have every member of your board make a personal guarantee. So that's really onerous. Once you do one of those loans, you can't do anything else. So if you've already financed like an addition to your commercial building, you can't finance anything else because you've already pledged everything you've owned as collateral. And often interest rates aren't necessarily priced by risk, so there might be a very limited range of interest rates that the banks are allowed to charge, and they might be quite high. Perhaps fairly so, given the risk in these markets. The third challenge is capital repatriation. So if an investor invests in a large solar project or a hydro project, obviously they need to get their money back out. They need to recoup those payments as they come back. And countries like Nepal are very hungry for dollars and other stable currencies, so they often make it pretty difficult for money to get back out of the country. And there's also issues with currency inflation. And so it's dangerous as an international investor to put a lot of money into a market like Nepal because the rupee's been appreciating by 5% a year. There's a lot of risks entailed there. And fourth is the technology supply chain, which is really just introducing these technologies to a new country and finding a way to import what you need effectively. And I mentioned the lack of electrical standards that can make it really difficult. If you build a system according to a certain set of standards and then they extend the grid to your region and you want to connect to the grid, well, if you aren't sort of in line with how they're building the grid extension project, that's going to be really difficult for your project. And finally, a problem that might might be an issue in Nepal, but perhaps isn't as big an issue as the other ones, is subsidized electricity. So in a lot of these markets, the government will heavily subsidize residential electricity, which is a policy that's that people are really happy with in the short term. But it means that if you're basically buying power that was generated by a hydro plant at 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and you're building solar where the levelized cost of energy is 2 or 3 times that, it's really hard to compete against that. So, and because Nepal is 93% hydro, the electricity is very cheap for the government to generate, and they do also subsidize it additionally. So that makes it difficult to compete with that cost. So now let's sort of bring it back down to earth and talk about barriers to adoption of solar that are a little bit more accessible and that SunFarmer can actually affect. And so there were issues with the early incentive schemes that were used to promote solar. There was also a sort of pattern of systems breaking due to poor design and construction. And there's also an issue of long-term accountability. So just to walk through these really quickly, or rather, actually to walk through the second point. So what we found when we first entered Nepal in 2014 is that a lot of these projects that were getting built by NGOs and paid for by foreign aid dollars would break after 1 or 2 years. Maybe they were poorly wired, or the technology that was used was very low quality, and nobody was really monitoring these systems or watching over them. And to point number 3, there was no long-term accountability. So this is a new industry. Understandably, there's lots of entrepreneurs in Kathmandu who say, okay, it's easy enough. I can import solar panels from India, set up the systems, and sell them. And that makes a lot of sense. But these people didn't have experience installing these systems. They were really just traders, kind of importing a product, assembling it, and selling it. And so when these systems broke and the customer called up the very small company that they employed to install the system, nobody answered the phone, and the people are nowhere to be found. So that was an issue that we heard again and again. And so I guess this is kind of in hindsight. If we had been systematic in our approach to entering Nepal, these would be sort of the 3 issues that we would build our business model around, and use these 3 interventions to kind of try to tackle and improve the solar ecosystem in Nepal. So the first is sort of advocating for better solar incentives that are more aligned with the incentives of the customer and the contractor who builds the system. The second is trying to implement standards that keep the quality in design and construction high so that those issues that I mentioned don't occur. And finally, in terms of maintaining long-term accountability of the person who constructs the system, the best way to do that is to have a means to watch over the system and understand how it's performing in the long term. So maybe rather than a donor discovering 3 years later that the system they paid for only functioned for a year and then it stopped working, so people disassembled it and used the components for some other purpose in their village. Now we have a way to kind of immediately know if the system is down. And so that our third intervention was to design and implement a remote monitoring system. So just to walk through these 3 different issues. And actually, I'm going to take a step back and just describe what we're doing in the commercial PV space. So SunFarmer basically operates as a nonprofit in the US whose mission is to uplift the solar ecosystem in the countries in which we operate and find ways to really bring a market that's quite nascent and advance it to a better place. But how we operate in Nepal is as a for-profit social enterprise. So essentially what that means is our philosophy isn't one-time use of philanthropic capital, but rather to seed a company that operates as a for-profit business. And yes, it's trying to bring solar energy to people in remote regions, powering health clinics, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a social mission for sure, but our goal, and we're about to achieve that goal, is to have a company that if the nonprofit disappeared, it would continue to operate into the future. And so the reason I bring this up is we're really interested in building commercial PV systems for customers of any sort, industrial, commercial, et cetera. And so in terms of the three interventions that we use to improve the commercial PV ecosystem. So the first was that, maybe a lot of you are familiar in the US with the investment tax credit and incentives that the government puts out to incentivize people to build renewable energy. So in Nepal, the incentive that was in place was that anytime someone built a solar installation, the government would basically provide a percentage rebate and just give a grant effectively to rebate you for a percentage of that project, which is really simple to understand, and it's easy to operate that system. But the problem was that the contractors that I mentioned who might disappear after a couple of years because they they moved on to another business or what have you, they were inflating project costs and oversizing the batteries or oversizing the panels relative to what the customer actually needed just to get a higher subsidy from the government, which is a huge misalignment between the customer and the contractor, because if the contractor is receiving that subsidy, yes, it allows them to provide a lower price to the consumer, but they're the ones getting that money. And so their incentive is to build as many projects as possible, as quickly as possible, and make them as expensive as possible, even if they don't need to be. So this was a real problem. So the president of SunFarmer Nepal actually used to work in the Alternative Energy Promotion Center of Nepal. And so through 2 years of lobbying and advocacy, SunFarmer, among many other players, really made the point that this system was not working and we needed a new incentive system. And so the scheme that came about, partially due to our advocacy and our lobbying, was that rather than just provide an upfront grant in the beginning, banks would actually provide subsidized loans that were very cheap to finance solar arrays. So this means that the contractor who builds the array has to stick around, because all of a sudden the customer has a loan and they're paying back their system over time, and so they need that system to work. So to provide a good service, the contractor needs to be able to perform maintenance, and that was something that we thought was really important. It also encourages contractors to bid right-sized projects, because now the customer is taking out a loan and they're paying interest on it, so obviously they want it to be as cost-effective as possible, and the contractor isn't being rewarded based on the size of the project. So this is really exciting that this is in place, and this is a model that we think is really promising for a lot of countries in the region as well, other countries in the region. I will just mention the caveats that what I mentioned before about banks requiring additional collateral beyond the system still applies to this financing as well. So it's been really disappointingly slow in terms of how these funds have been deployed. But we're excited because we've actually built some of the first projects that are using these loans. So it's getting there, but there's still issues. To the point of systems kind of going defunct after a year or two. And here's just a picture of a collapsed racking system of something that wasn't built very appropriately versus a racking system that some of our technicians are installing on a school in Kathmandu. There's a lot of components that go into an effective off-grid or even grid-tied solar system, and those include making sure that the racking is safe and that the components are assembled correctly, but also that there's appropriate grounding and lightning protection. There's just a lot of things that can go wrong that an engineer who's used to working in a grid-tied setting might not even identify. So we've actually assembled a team of Nepalis in Kathmandu who are really, really highly qualified engineers who have worked in off-grid settings for years and years. And so we're able to maintain really high quality standards for our customers, and we're able to provide maintenance contracts for 5 or 6 years. So rather than being one of those contractors that just builds the system and then disappears, we're comfortable signing on for the long run because we know we're building high quality systems that won't break and that will serve the customer for years to come. Because at this point, solar technology is mature enough that there's no reason that solar panels shouldn't last for 15 or 20 years with basically no maintenance. So, yeah.
Battery DOD.
Oh, sorry, depth of discharge. So a lead acid battery, like what you have in your car, there's limitations about sort of how deeply you can discharge it, how close to zero it can get. And so it's important that in an off-grid system you're using the right batteries and you're using control systems that are kind of optimizing for where the battery keeps its charge. And if people can just drop power as much as they want, they could effectively drain all the batteries and destroy them. So you have to have something in place that kind of shuts down the power if the backup power in the batteries isn't sufficient. And so the third point, which was that investors and NGOs were unable to track how the projects they funded were performing, we realized that we really needed a solution to this, because if we wanted to be a value-add developer who actually built higher quality projects, we need to prove to the customer and to everyone in Nepal that that's valuable. And so in order to do that, we have to have a technology that can tell us how our systems are performing, and conversely can tell us how a poorly designed system is working or not working. So although there exists a lot of remote monitoring technologies on the market already, there was nothing that was sort of cheap enough and simple enough and appropriate for the Nepal market. So we actually just designed our own remote monitoring system that was really inexpensive and could just report back the state of charge of the battery, how much the panels were producing, et cetera. And so that allows us to quickly identify if a project goes down and then dispatch a maintenance crew without finding out about it from a phone call maybe a month later. And so we're able to sort of track a bunch of different metrics remotely through an online interface. So those are sort of, we talked about these systemic challenges to building solar in emerging markets, which aren't going away and need a lot of effort from organizations like USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, people that are working in concert with the Nepali government and other governments in the region to try to work some of these out so that there's less friction for investors to come in. But in terms of sort of specific barriers that we can tackle right now, this is what we identified, and this is what we built our business around on the commercial side. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about, we mentioned in the beginning that the goal was to provide energy to those who need it most, and to try to also be equitable in terms of how solar is being developed and make sure that it's reaching the bottom of the pyramid, and that there's a path to those people that live in regions that aren't going to get the grid realistically for years to come, or aren't necessarily going to get the attention that residents of a larger city like Kathmandu are going to get. What's the answer? What's the solution to bringing power to people in those kind of settings? And so the approach that we took was we looked at different customer segments, and we thought, where can solar play a really powerful role? And what we found is that in Nepal, about 70% of the population is working in agriculture in some way, shape, or form. But what's surprising is that nevertheless, Nepal is still a net importer of food. And that's because the growing season without any irrigation is only 3 months during that monsoon period. So unless you have some sort of pump or some way to irrigate your farm, you're only going to be growing crops for 3 or 4 months a year. So that causes a huge drain on theoretical production of agricultural products in Nepal. And furthermore, not only is the supply of food lower, but to the point earlier of poor power quality, a lot of ag processing industries aren't necessarily going to set up shop in Nepal. So maybe Nepal is growing a lot of rice, but then they might ship it to India to perform some processing step and then re-import that same food product. Because with inconsistent power, it's really difficult to invest in a large factory to perform that processing function. So that's another issue, that even if Nepal had sufficient food to feed its population, a lot of the steps required to get that food from the farm to the table aren't currently performable in Nepal. And so a lot of farmers, if they don't have irrigation or a way to sort of support themselves throughout the year, would resort to other means of obtaining income, potentially migrant labor, which has its own whole set of issues surrounding it. So Many farmers are able to irrigate their farms, and maybe they're using, some are using treadle pumps, like actually a manual pump that you would almost pedal with your feet. Some people are using manual irrigation where they've dug ditches and they're actually just bringing water around. But a lot of farmers are able to purchase or rent diesel-powered pumps, which are really cheap, but you have to keep putting fuel in them. So there's sort of lots of long-term operating costs. You have to keep them running, you have to keep them maintained. If you're renting, you have to pay per hour to use the pump. So there's often no path to ownership, and people are just kind of stuck pouring money into these pumps to irrigate their farm. So, we think a really elegant solution is a solar-powered pump that has no moving parts here, right? The generator is fixed and it's going to last for 15 or 20 years with very little maintenance. Hook that up to an AC pump and you're good to go. I mean, there's basically no operating costs. So it seems really great. Unfortunately, these farmers are, at large, pretty impoverished and unable to afford a system like this. And so the only way to really do it is to finance the system so that the savings that the farmers are achieving by displacing diesel and not continuing to use diesel fuel are effectively monetized, and they can use that savings and also hopefully the increase in income that they achieve by growing crops that have a higher water requirement. So if you can go from growing monsoon rice to growing cucumbers, you can dramatically increase your income and better afford to pay on a monthly basis for a financed solar water pumping system. So these photos are just a project that we recently completed in Chitwan. This is like basically a fish farm that you just have to keep filling up with water. And so the model that we created is really, we're the technical experts. What we provide is engineering, design, and mobilization to build these systems, but we don't have, on staff a panel of agricultural experts or a field staff of people that can go out and collect these payments from individual farmers. So what we did is we partnered with the agricultural cooperatives that are already talking to and interacting with hundreds of thousands of farmers. So these are the local organizations that provide small microfinance loans to farmers to purchase seed and other agricultural inputs. Maybe they also provide trainings for different agricultural technologies. Basically, they're sort of the hub around which the economic activity of a small region of farmers revolves. And so we knew that that was really key to form those partnerships. And so we basically provide rent-to-own financing for a 3-year term. We monitor the system and replace anything that breaks during that 3-year term. And then we pay fees to the cooperatives to have them collect the payments on our behalf. And so, the goal is that farmers can then grow crops year-round, and they can increase cultivation of higher value crops and hopefully see a huge uplift in their income. And so, this is a really difficult issue because Nepal is, really geographically varied. Broadly speaking, people often divide the country into sort of 3 strips. The Terai region, which is on the border with India, that's sort of the breadbasket of Nepal, the lowlands. Moving into the mid-hills, you can see it in the center, and then there's the Himalayan region north. So we think there's opportunity for solar-powered water pumping in all of these regions, but particularly in the Terai, where the head, which is the distance you have to pump the water vertically from its source to wherever you're delivering it, is quite low, maybe about 5 or 6 meters, and where there's a lot better market access because you can very easily ship your produce to some of the larger cities in the Terai or across the border to India. And so we're limited in how we finance these systems by the amount that a farmer can pay on a monthly basis, right? So we have to understand, how much a farmer can afford and how much they're able to pay towards installments to own the system. Yeah.
How much does the unit cost?
Yeah. So it really depends, but in this case, with this women's cooperative, it was 3 women who have a system that provides about 25,000 liters a day, and it was about $2,000, but it was about 40% subsidized. So that's the point I'm going to get to right now, which is sort of the gap for this to be the gap between this being a fully commercially viable product. So to put that in context, a diesel pump might cost like $300 or $400. So it's significantly more expensive. So they're going to achieve long-term savings, and the payback's usually around year 6 or 7. But in order to achieve that, you need to have a way to make it affordable in the meantime. And so at the moment, given what farmers in the Terai are able to pay, we have to close the gap with a 40% subsidy. So, to put this in context, a lot of solar water pumping systems in Nepal are fully subsidized. So the government, or like Windrock or various development agencies, will build large systems that are completely free and provide them to communities. But we think that in the long term, it's really important to see a path towards full commercial viability so that this is easily scaled. And so the way we see that happening is currently farmers will only sign on to like a 3-year contract. So what we need to do is get the financing on a longer term. And so that will require the participation of local banks. And in order for them to gain comfort, they're going to have to see a record of repayments over maybe a year or two. So we think that within 2 or 3 years, we can get banks comfortable with this technology. Simultaneously, we think that costs will come down dramatically. There's a lot of efforts right now to design like radically affordable water pumps that are like $250 or $300. These are solar-powered water pumps. And so we're talking to those design teams and trying to implement their prototypes and get to a place where we can make the product much less expensive. But it's definitely going to take some time to get to full commercial viability. And so just briefly, in terms of what is next for the solar industry in Nepal, financing is still a huge challenge. I mean, banks are unwilling to lend without significant collateral. They're unwilling to lend for longer time horizons, and the interest rates are still very high. That's local financing. International financing is even more difficult because it's really difficult to repatriate your money out of the country once you've invested it in. And also there's just currency risk, a ton of risks that mean that a foreign investor is going to ask for a very high rate of return, which is probably not going to be supportable with a solar project. There's still a lack of regulatory clarity from the Nepali government in terms of how larger systems are going to be connected to the grid and what they're going to pay for them. And also just there's the ongoing challenges of working in the Himalayan region in terms of high transportation costs. And that's probably not going to go away for a long time. So that's just a fact of life working in a place like Nepal. And in terms of what we're really excited about in the near future, we finally see the opportunity for multi-megawatt projects. So something like on the order of the Yale power plant that we could actually build if there's a path to selling that energy to the grid. And I think someday there's an opportunity for Nepal to be a power exporter. So thinking about hydro, with the second largest hydro resource, it's entirely possible that if Nepal is able to build those very large hydro projects and potentially some very large solar projects as well, that they can more than supply energy for their 30 million people, and they can ship electricity across the border to their very hungry, power-consuming neighbor, India. So those are some of the exciting future developments and things that we're seeing in the next couple of years. And that just about does it for what I had prepared, but I'd love to open the conversation up and discuss the future of solar in Nepal. Thanks.